First of all, let me thank Cooper Union and Nader and Lorena for inviting us, and it's been incredible. We just started a couple, 4 weeks ago? We have a great group of students, and it's really fun, so we're really appreciative. Now I'm going to read a little bit of this introduction because I'm going to try to link together our parallel cities research with our practice. And you would think it was not congruent, that they don't really go together, but we think they do, so I'll try to explain that. Our practice has largely followed two paths, research and design, through a wide range of architectural projects that have led us to produce deliberately a highly diverse portfolio of architectural projects, and we will be showing them later in the lecture. One of the projects most important to the work as a whole has been our 20 years of research into the history and current manifestations of multi-level urbanism. This project began in 1998 with a Graham Foundation grant and ultimately led, as Lorena mentioned, led to publication of the book in 2016. It transformed how, this may go back and forth. It transformed how we think about the architect's role in the process of urbanization and the various forms of agency that are available to us at different levels of practice. We also learned that many of these questions are essentially political, and it is always important to maintain a critical relationship with the ideas as they can change from utopian to dystopian in a matter of years. So when we get into the multi-level urbanism, we're saying be very critical, maintain both perspectives as you look at the various ideas.
It's there.
Okay. Although this may seem like an unlikely pairing of topics, we believe that the issues entailed in this reciprocal contextualization are indispensable to a more informed and reflexive form of practice. Our research project, as well as our practice, could be described as something akin to Ariadne's thread, which is a Greek myth if you know it, a systematic survey of complex topics to begin to identify the diversity of issues contained within. Another way to describe this project is as a process of turning over stones to reveal the extent of the terrain. So we are not asking that architects necessarily remain obedient to any particular context or condition that they encounter. On the contrary, we are asking that the full spectrum of contextual issues be considered in the creative process. This is a view of contextualization that is about broadening rather than narrowing the scope of the architect.
Did that work?
No.
Nope.
So, here we go.
Oops, hold on. There we go.
So this is the book. I don't really need to talk about this, but I wanted to just show, this is the Keller Gallery at MIT, and Nader was kind enough to enable us to mount an exhibition of the work when it was really critical. We were just beginning to develop our ideas and our research, and this gallery exhibition really catalyzed our efforts. Now Jenny will do the heavy lifting.
So this is an image of Constance's New Babylon from the Drawing Center exhibition in 1999. I think we started our research in 97. But our interest began with our own cities, developed out of multi-level concepts beginning in the late 50s and culminating in the parallel skyway systems of Minneapolis and St. Paul, one public and one private, but both informally developed. Fascinated by the systems in North America and Asia, how they spread incrementally, their ideological origins, and resemblances to the seemingly disconnected work of Constant and Team 10, we began a process of research into the origins of the systems, and working over 20 years concurrently with our practice, we attempted to trace a trajectory of an idea, the multi-level city. It has been endlessly fascinating and completely baffling that these continue to grow informally in many cities, but seemed invisible to architects and urbanists, aside from critics who focused on their negative formations and simply suggested that they be taken down. In the 1980s and 90s, the systems grew exponentially while architects and urbanists pretended they weren't there. Seen in the montage on the left, Constant Neuenhuis's New Babylon, and on the right, the systems developed in Minneapolis, but also through North America. We were interested in why the work of avant-garde artists and architects from the 50s and 60s seemed to contain an uncanny resemblance to the ad hoc and very banal systems we had been studying. So where did these ideas come from? In Minneapolis, they came from multiple charismatic figures. Rainer Banham at the Walker Art Center, who also published our Parallel Cities book, promoting concepts of the clip-on, the plug-in, and non-plan at a really critical time. Victor Gruen's more pragmatically driven ideas for Fort Worth generated concurrently with his work on Southdale, the first enclosed shopping mall, and planning for downtown St. Paul, which imported European multi-level ideas. Ironically, these were initially idealistic and supported by people like Jane Jacobs. And lastly, Buckminster Fuller, whose Minnesota Experimental City Project promoted a synthesized megastructural version of the multi-level city. So in that period of time, everybody became fascinated with the multi-level city. And it had all these ways of propagating itself. We were particularly interested in implementation, how these megastructure-like systems began. Minneapolis is 8 miles, and why and how they grew. The system really began with Gruen's work on Southdale and then migrated to Minneapolis. Gruen was motivated by the idea that these pedestrian systems and shopping centers could become civic space, an idea that was designed more socially focused at first and then became driven entirely by economic and political interests and implemented through bureaucratic processes. What made his system possible was that he designed it as a kit of parts, not as a complete design plan, but as a set of elements to be used a la carte and over time. We observed in 2002 with the World Trade Center competitions the reemergence of another kind of multi-level urbanism. This form with interconnected rooftop enclaves is very different than those open networks following the datum parallel to the street level. We were also very interested in the resemblance of these projects to very particular early 20th century avant-garde forms of urbanism. These are 3 Russian constructivist projects by the Veznin brothers, ABC, Litsitsky and Martstam, and Melnikov. Our understanding of this migration and development of ideas began with the interwar period of London. While there is much made about the importance of modernism through the importation of modernism through Siam, less is known about the exportation of a distinctly British set of ideas that developed prior to the famous urban proposals of Team 10 and Allison and Peter Smithson. This is the Mars Group's plan for London, ostensibly a radical utopian set of ideas around the multi-level city that was never implemented. But this project and its authors were the origin of experiments with multi-level circulation networks that would influence the architectural culture of London over the next 30 years, directing the future forms of the international multi-level city. So our research was kind of a lot in archives and in obscure places, trying to understand the connections between different figures and relationships. So following the work on the Mars Plan and the publication of Russian constructivist multi-level projects in Architectural Review in '37, which was before modernism was even introduced to London, there began a period of rampant experimentation in interwar London on the multi-level city. What was most interesting to us is that it resulted in both speculative and built ideas that grew out of an international exchange of ideas. This very different version of the modern multi-level city can be traced from its origins in the reformist urban ideas of social utopian thinkers around the French Revolution. Charles Fourier's utopian phalanstère and the elevated street gallery as a communal palace for all are arguably the beginnings of the ambition of the social project of the city explored in the early 20th century, beginning its migration as a social utopian prototype for a future city form, which is very unlike its eventual impact and form, into the work of Henri-Jules Borré's aerodrome projects in the 1850s, Jules-Antoine Molin's utopian city of the 1860s, and Eugene Renard between 1890 and 1910. Hilbersheimer's sectional proposal for an ideal city where architecture and infrastructure merged, a city that eliminates speculation and ad hoc development. But maybe more important than the work that was about rationalizing and planning the city was the fantastic work of the constructivists reimagining the multi-level city of Fourier. This is a concept of a floating city by Russian constructivist Lazar Kaidakul of 1925. Elements of Soviet architecture began to be viewed as tools of social changes or social condensers, and inevitably focused on reimagining the social spatial concepts proposed by the French social utopians. The government furthered this experiment at an extremely large scale into these social components, and their promotion through a series of international competitions. While much of this work was never built, it was integral to the development and promotion of new architectural practices internationally. Le Corbusier's time in Moscow and his plan for Moscow began to transform his practice. On the left, his Centro Soyuz competition of 1928, and on the right, the plan for Rio de Janeiro in 1929, kind of the beginning of the introduction of kind of a more lyrical form of architecture. Shows some of this more fantastic work of multi-level urbanism started to directly transform his work. This work is lyrical and expressive, but still a plan, a closed logic, but prioritizes the pleasure and experience of movement and social interaction over efficiency. Bertold Lubetkin, a student at Vakutamus and former employee of both Melnikov and Le Corbusier, was very influential in London in promoting the socially minded lyricism movement. On the right, his famous Penguin Pool into London architecture cultures. The 30-mile plan for London's Pedway, yes, 30 miles of elevated pedestrian systems, was an actual plan in the 1940s, was the earliest and most ambitious multi-level system, and it was done secretly. But it was only built incrementally, and then they began taking it down, and are now speculating on a very different form of it, much like the World Trade Center competitions. At that time, there was a confluence of factors that made the possibility of a radical new urban form seem tangible. Over time, the closely knit group of designers who created the Mars Group plan for London influenced from within the London County Council the ideas and implementation of numerous urban projects, including the South Bank, the Barbican, premised on the idea of social communication and expanding to the scale of the city. This led to the subsequent appearance of spectacular and experimental urban ideas in the 1950s, directly influencing the subsequent widespread proliferation and deployment of elevated pedestrian systems in the 60s. One of the key things that was interesting is that after the war, there weren't jobs for architects, so they all worked for the government. So you had people like the Smithsons and Cedric Price in government. Archigram, Allison and Peter Smithson's Golden Lane housing on the right, and the Pedway plan, which they were part of working on in the London County Council. And their idea of streets in the sky kind of emerged out of these ideas. There are also important overlaps between bureaucracies in the avant-garde. In addition, this is Archigram's work on the South Bank. Warren Chalk, Dennis Crompton, Ron Heron worked for the London County Council for 8 years, working on very everyday projects, while Peter Cook worked for developer Taylor Woodbridge on shopping malls on the right. So a lot of the ideas that they experimented with really came out of this work and went back and forth between the speculative and the everyday. And London County Council competitions promoted new multi-level forms and then implemented them. This is Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond, the Barbican Center in London. Cedric Price, who also worked with the London County Council and his non-planned concept, which has been so influential, and his more temporal Fun Palace. In post-war period, this network extended to Asia, and through key figures like the Smithsons, the Metabolists, members of the London County Council who also worked in Hong Kong, Archigram and Cedric Price, the more prevalent ideas we know today were spread internationally. Cities like Hong Kong have followed a distinct trajectory since the 60s, using multi-level urbanisms reactively to accommodate increased density and reduce congestion, pollution, and crime, while promoting economic development. The same planners for London advised on the multi-level urbanisms at the very beginnings in Hong Kong. Despite the differences in context and cultures, the framework and planning principles they advocated were very similar. Due to the government ownership of all lands and Hong Kong's lack of a significant historic conservation agenda, the implementation of the system would be far more ambitious than it had been in London. The other part of these systems is just the diversity of typologies and all of the different conditions they're reacting to, which is the central escalator on the left, one of the bridges and connectors down on the right in Hong Kong. Synthesizing the City. What is most interesting about the Asian urban models is their diversity, adaptability, and integration of larger urban systems such as transportation. As architects, we're also interested in how design experimentation has been implemented into the city form in real time. One of the other trajectories that we have been interested in is how ideas are transferred from academic contexts and academic research and experimentation to the public and private realm. In Singapore, ideas were directly imported from the Architectural Association and Harvard through people like William Lin and Spur, as well as the metabolists. Chongqing is an interesting combination in China of plan and non-plan, and a rapidly developing synthesized city with very dramatic forms of elevated systems that are both transport and pedestrian. Other more recent proposals, like Stephen Hall's Link Hybrid, explore the logic of the buildings as prototype extended to the city. Hall and others use the term social connectors or condensers, as the constructivists did, to describe the link bridges. The success of Singapore's competitions, which promote multi-level urbanism and began to create templates for future development, also spurred this kind of experimentation. This is a competition won by Woha Architects of Singapore on the right. On the left is the city's template for elevated systems that then generated the proposal from 2001. And then this is their Breathing Cities competition, which is much later, really starting to speculate, much as was done in London, on these kinds of systems. Ol Sheeran's Interlace project, which is a private development, picking up on the public layering. The initial attempt at planning for the Futian system district in Shenzhen on the left, and 3 different urban typology zones. The Team 10 influenced Skyway system at the south, Le Corbusier influenced podium level at the north, and the mid-level connector ring. The extreme scale of podium conditions are really interesting, how they tried to mediate between the 2 scales. OMA won the competition for the connector ring, and this is the Shenzhen Creative Center of 2009, where this very large kind of pedestrian infrastructural links started to mediate between these 2 extreme scales. Another competition at the south in the 1960s shopping district, an entry by MVRDV's for a 3D street idea. And the idea was how do you get these systems to touch down again, which has influenced a lot of their work since on multi-level urbanism. Work AC, who won that competition along with the local firm Zubo, also experimenting with ideas about connecting up and down and inside and outside, and more complex circulation paths and forms. In Shenzhen, there's the Hong Kong Shenzhen Biennale, where they exchange ideas and this kind of speculation that's been ongoing. Rocker Lang Architects from the Biennale in 2013-2014 on the right, and a more recent pavilion by Urbanus, a Chinese firm, on the left, based out of Shenzhen. So along with the global importation of new forms, there's ongoing experimentation with the multi-level city. So we developed a series of these themes that have kind of come in and out of our work because we've been doing this for 20 years and it's been concurrent to our practice, and we're kind of always talking about these conditions.
So this is one of the more important debates. The donkey path urbanisms is our paraphrasing of Le Corbusier's critique of non-planned settlements or informally grown cities, traditional cities. This is one of the more important debates inherent in theories of practice that attempt to bridge between the scales of urban morphogenesis, between planning scales and architectural scales. You could even say between fluid and the granular. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. Of course, donkey path urbanism paraphrases Le Corbusier's critique of traditional and informally developed cities in favor of planning techniques of the modern movement. Catherine Ingram's critique of Le Corbusier and CM's rational planning in architecture and the burdens of linearity revived this critique. So fast forward to Patrick Schumacher's paper on parametric urbanisms, and the argument is ostensibly resolved through the smooth effects of parametric design. So if you're familiar with this paper, this came out I think in 2009 or 10, where Patrick Schumacher is advocating for the sort of the universal adoption of parametric design, including the aesthetics of it. So like CM, they had their aesthetics the modernist movement, and Patrick is advocating parametric urbanism. And within the parametric tools, he believes that the granular, the more fine-scale characteristics of urban development and design and development can actually be integrated into these kinds of smooth environments. But the question is, if it's a smooth environment, if it's kind of a plastic adaptation of a particular style, is that really an open-ended urban process? What happens in 5 years? Can you change it? There are a whole lot of questions entailed in that affect urbanization. So we don't agree with this, and we believe that the vitality of urban environments depends not solely on the smoothing of differences through conformity, but the articulation of difference and coherence through engagement, through contextual engagement at many scales. We turn to Friato to find a conceptual frame to address these questions. And if you know Friato's studies of urban development, of traditional urban forms and their evolution through time-dependent processes, this is a way of integrating both the large-scale urban strategies and planning techniques with granular, more localized, more socially active ways of building cities. So this last drawing, this is basically a little fragment from the video that Jenny showed, and this shows the Minneapolis grid, the rational planning grid of the city block, with the superimposed with the skyway system. And each of those little idiosyncratic knots that you see in the plan is evidence of this kind of local negotiation, the building owners, the developers, the city bureaucrats, all working to resolve certain things in very particular ways. So we're not advocating this as design, but we're saying this is evidence of that more granular scale interaction that makes cities interesting, as well as the larger scale organizing principles that guide the larger program. So for the, whoops.
That's okay. It's just power.
So for the past 20 years, we have combined our design research, teaching, and practice following a set of interests coming out of practice but informed by research. Our teaching and creative research is an important part of our work, allowing us to ask broader questions about practice and to encourage more experimentation at a range of scales. And so I've already talked about parametric urbanisms, and I'd like to just start to talk about the Walker Library in Minneapolis. Now this is a small project, so you say, what does this have to do with multi-level urbanisms? Well, what it's got to do with is an attitude about how you interact with context. This takes one approach that we are advocating. So the project is really about the street, creating civic space along with a series of layers and through a series of inflections. Our intent is to do buildings that are innovative, individual, but completely tied into their context, so that if you take them out, they don't make sense. So it's both a way of advocating for invention, but also a contextualization that makes them part of a larger field. And this is an example of that. So you see we've basically manipulated the building form to respond to the general street patterns and major monuments like the Uptown Theater, which is the most prominent building in the area.
One of the things it does is on the street inflects in order to make space for people where it's needed, and on the upper portion it reacts to traffic and movement on the street.
Right, so here you see the scale of the building conforms to the Hennepin. This is Hennepin Avenue in Minneapolis. I didn't say that, but it's important. But so this conforms to the general scale, but it's a building that is completely different in character within that scale.
One thing we should also mention is that these are all public projects that usually end up being very banal because they're very low budget, and so these are projects that they're not looking for design architects. So there's also a lot of negotiation with that process.
And so then just a series of sort of creating the living room for the community, space where people can see into the building, go into the building, and look back into and relate to the city street. And these are some of the major spaces. It's basically a big box typology. So if you think of the big box suburban development, this is a really simple building with a large room and support spaces attached to it. The clear story elements basically orient to different, in different directions so that they are lit up by the sun at different times of the day, changing the ambiance of the interior. So one of the things that's this has been embraced by the neighborhood, and they have a large annual art festival that takes place right on the street in front of the building, which is exciting, and it's been adopted, and people really, really value its presence in their community. So now this is St. John's Abbey. Do you want to do this one? So this is basically a set of projects that we did on a campus in central Minnesota that was largely designed by Marcel Breuer. And we were asked to do 3 different projects, and each one of them deals with circulation at the scale of a building, but they're 3-dimensional conditions and a highly contextual in nature. So that's the main building on the campus. This was built in the 50s and 60s as part of the Vatican II. Very beautiful church.
There were a series at St. John's of 10 projects that Breuer did in addition to the master planning, and they were all experimentations with cast-in-place concrete, but also very low cost.
And so that diagram shows the 3 projects we worked on. The larger L-shaped building is the chapter house.
The guest house.
Or the guest house. The middle one is the chapter house, and then the chapel inside the church. And this is part of the chapter house. The chapter house is an original element in the building complex where the monks, this is a Catholic community, where the monks would use the chapter house as a gathering place and basically exclude the general public. But they wanted to change that, so they asked us to look at how could they recharge this space. And one of the things we discovered was that we could integrate a whole set of practical circulation connections that needed to be made with the church through a kind of surgical intervention that extended the form of the chapter house and made it seamlessly part of the original composition. In fact, the Breuer had already planned an elongated building in that shape, so we were able to work within that logic. And then this shows the 3-dimensional connections that were devised to basically bring handicapped and elderly people into the church, into the lower level, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a kind of intricate circulation problem. So these are just some of the connections between upper and lower level. So this is a very small project. Now within the church itself, we modified an office basically on the side of the nave of the church and provided a chapel. We looked at this as an example of some of the beautiful detailing in the church itself that we were inspired by but reluctant to just copy. So
one of the more interesting parts is the concrete, the formwork and the texture of the concrete was made out of very fine slatted wood, so you have this very fine wood texture in lines, fine lines all over everything.
Right, so this is basically cutting a new door into the wall and then installing a wood-lined interior finish to the room that provided a reredos wall so they could put the Blessed Sacrament in the space and have small services in the room. So this is basically an element that's lit from behind. So this project is really just about contextual response on a very fine scale. And then the guest house is a place where laity can go and have an experience somewhat similar to what the monks do, where they can mix and congregate and gather together. And it's designed around the idea that we would take a cloister and cut it in half and then divide it into and pull it apart so we would have 3 levels. So this splits what is typically an enclosed space elsewhere in the complex and makes it connect outward to the landscape. There's circulation, very simple concrete structural system.
But it's similar in the Walker Library in that it takes these patterns of movement and treats them as figures to kind of organize the building.
Right, so here you see the upper residential apartments, or the rooms, and then the courtyard that's formed on the edge of a lake with a forest. And some of the common spaces. Again, these are sandwiched in between rooms on the upper level and the lower level. And then some decorative screening.
These were a series of precast blocks that are twisted to create the complex patterning.
So then
another project that we thought is interesting to talk about within this context is the Minnesota Museum of American Art in St. Paul. We just finished the first phase, and the second phase is starting construction right about now. What's interesting about this is kind of where it came from. So these are images of the Palais Royal in Paris, arguably the beginnings of multilevel urbanisms, which are actually found at the site of the museum. And urban space layered with theatricality, complex changing program, and movement. The Palais Royal and the Paris arcades, Walter Benjamin talked about the Palais Royal as this kind of utopian idea that had influenced the Fallon Stair, and the arcades, and this kind of life of the city, and the layering and all of the excitement. The original building for the Minnesota Museum of American Art is an L-shaped commercial glass vaulted arcade from the turn of the century, importing the Paris arcades to downtown St. Paul by Cass Gilbert. And it's wrapped around the city's first tower with a 14-story glass atrium. It's been modified incrementally over time, and most significantly in the 1960s with the introduction of the Skyway system in downtown St. Paul. The project is a new contemporary art museum in this historic building complex, and at the intersection of the 60s system and the 1890s idealized system on the lower level. The project became the idea of the art block, creating complex changing programming knitted together through multi-level circulation. So a lot of these were about kind of creating connectors. The building really hadn't benefited over time. The entry to the Endicott was bricked off and had been modified. So we opened up this first level street, so really connecting inside and outside on the street, and bringing through what was once a former bank space up to the Skyway level. This is the new upper level entry. So there's significant entries on both levels. And this is the former bank space. And to the left, to the right is the street access, to the left is the old loading dock. We built custom furniture and pieces to all of this. This is a brass kind of curved desk with a flat perforated black steel screen over it. And then this is the old alley, which originally served coal, pulling in coal and loading to the whole complex, but then was interiorized in the 1960s when the Skyway was inserted above it. So now this is interior space. So we restored it to go back to the old alleyway. And it connects to new art galleries on the contemporary side. But we really like this idea of this ruin of these layers of history that were exposed in other places.
Yeah, we should say that these Cass Gilbert's, these are his earliest tall buildings, and they're really beautiful, but they, over the years, especially since the 50s, they've been just totally abused. So we're trying to find what's left in these buildings that we can work with and bring back to life. So it's been a kind of a remedial process trying to resuscitate his great architecture.
And this is the old loading dock, which had been layered with a lot of layers of commercial space, totally closed off. You couldn't see the arches. And so we're peeling off the layers. This is the bridge coming across and a skylight that looks up onto this kind of hidden facade of the building.
The spider webs, that's Sheila Pepe's work. She's a nationally known artist.
Based in New York.
Based in New York, and she did this for the opening, so that's not part of the
It's not part of the architecture. But one of the qualities that this creates are these kind of layered urban spaces between the old and the new, inside and outside that's now been interiorized, that plays off of the layering of the art, and the curators use those qualities.
So in these spaces, I mean, we found this you know, when it's activated with people, it's really a lot like what is described in the Palais Royal by Fourier and later by Lefebvre. So it's really kind of exciting to see that kind of chemistry happen in real life.
And this is the glass vaulted arcade for the phase that's currently started construction, turned into more galleries. This seems like an implausible project for an architect to take on as a rest stop, but it's been one of our most interesting in recent years. And it's kind of how we played it out. How it connects back to our research is that there was one of the early ideas that we talked about that was very interesting was what Le Corbusier described as a lyrical intent for the city and its circulation after visiting Moscow in the 20s. This is Kinetic Constructive System by Moholy Nagy about the social and aesthetic experience of movement in 1922 and 1923. Le Corbusier's Central Soyuz project in Moscow, and one of the many central stairs on Bertold Lubetkin's housing complex. It's less about efficiency and more about social exchange and the experience of movement. The existing 1971, this is what we saw when we went to the first site visit in the upper right corner, the little witch's hat. And they wanted to try to save it, and we still went after the project. But it's an awkward little round building with a single entry, no connection to site, and a series of matching picnic shelters. It also had an extremely low budget because it's a Minnesota Department of Transportation project. But it's actually one of the most public and heavily used building typologies, and this is the gateway to one of the most beautiful parts of Minnesota, the Arrowhead region, the northern part of the state. The intersecting, this is a site plan as it develops. If you look at the double yoked kind of structure, one of those, the smaller circle is the original footprint of the original structure. So we used the intersection elliptical circulation paths drawn from the original rest stop to weave the building into the site, restored a lot of this kind of circular structure. We liked the kind of organic 1960s and 70s kind of master planning. And this is the structure as it developed. It's a concrete burnished block, wood clad, and it serves automobile and truck travel, promotes tourism and vehicular safety, which is where we really kind of pulled out the agenda for movement. So one of the ideas is that they want people to stop and slow down. So instead of the direct path of the original, it was more like how can you elongate and exaggerate, and that became the agenda for movement. Structural columns define seating areas and guide movement from inside to out. This is at night, which it's open 24 hours, 365 days a year. The bathrooms. MnDOT didn't want to deal with artists, so they let us do the art, which was great, and they let us design the play structures, and so it was a really fun kind of all integrated project. So the aluminum piece on the wall was by us. A bridge overlooking the creek, which hadn't been seen before, and was kind of the important part of the project that we developed. So we really see this as, well, it provides basic amenities, safety. It's really an apparatus for slowing people down. So instead of directly going in and out as before, you create this loop that connects the two entries, and the bridge basically overlooks the creek. And encourages people to stop and wander the site. Corten steel railings for the retaining wall then turn into the railings for the ramp or the bridge as you move around. The play structures, shading areas.
So we have two more projects to show, and then we'll be done. This is something you may be familiar with, the Charles Hostler Center, but we wanted to show it because it's essentially a building design that comes out of the matte building typology. If you think of projects like the Berlin Free University by Candelas, Yosik, and Woods, you're familiar with this building type that was developed in the 50s and 60s. And so there was a lot of interest in these kinds of forums, renewed interest when we began the competition, but we wanted to look at developing a design for the Hostler Center in a competition that was much more environmentally responsive. So
we're currently working on another competition right now on the campus. I don't think they've done one in 10 years maybe.
Yeah, about 10 years. Against OMA, and
we're not going to win that.
So it's like
yeah, it's hopeless.
But it's fun. So this is a view from the Corniche on the Mediterranean. It's a very beautiful site. And so what we did was we started developing a kind of a strategy from the original master planning block, which is basically a big massive building. We started to spread the program out across the site and then subtract from that mass in order to create the building complex.
One of the things that also was part of this was the kind of irregularities caused by context and site, the kind of hillside where cool air comes down in the morning, sea breezes coming across the rooftop at night. The idea that kind of shaped the Beirut streets of connecting those kind of airflows and cooling.
And we were working with Matthias Schuler from Trans-Solar on this project, which was a wonderful collaboration. We learned a lot from him. So this is a model we did of this kind of distributed program. And what we found was that in breaking the building apart and basically reversing the convention, which is, in the books on environmental design, like Design with Climate, they'll tell you in this latitude you orient the building east and west as an elongated bar, thinking solely of the building. And if it's just a building by itself, yes, that makes sense. But we found that if we rotated that to a perpendicular orientation, we would radically increase the shading of both the courtyards and the buildings next to the other buildings. So it turned out to be a complete inversion of what the standard rule of thumb was. So this shows some of the thinking that we went through to open the building up, so it wasn't just simply a response that was based on like an arid climate, but also taking advantage of the Mediterranean aspect of that region. And then this is the site plan of the project. And then here you see, looking down on the building complex, a series of courtyards and spaces that connect the various parts of the program.
The bridges connect rooftop social spaces, and it's about this kind of migration between day and night, above and below.
And so our notion was that if we actually create this mat condition, we can actually increase the usable space for the building as a whole by activating the full site, and providing a wide diversity of environmental conditions for people to occupy. And the buildings, I should mention that the buildings are clad in stone. They're concrete structures clad in stone with plaster on the interior. Is a fairly inexpensive building system.
But the first cavity wall.
Yeah,
in
this
Lebanon.
is one of the first major cavity wall applications in Lebanon. Also, seawater cooling, pre-cooling for the system, which now serves the lower campus, was part of what Trans-Solar helped develop. And radiant cooling for the major spaces like the gymnasium. So the ceiling is chilled just down to above the dew point, so it doesn't condense on the ceiling. It just maintains the right temperature to keep the room cool. It makes it much more comfortable. And it's a heavily insulated wall building system. And then there's a swimming pool. So the synthesized city. Now, is this you or me?
Oh, we can go back and forth. One of the things that we were interested in is some of the early ambitions for the city. This is Harley Wiley Corbet in New York, who worked with, was influenced by Eugene Annard, and this kind of rational but visionary urban forms of the capitalist city in America, integrating all of these future forms of transportation. So one of the things that we've been interested in is this integration of what we call the synthesized city, of large-scale infrastructure and multi-level urbanism. This was the 1960s, the second regional plan for New York, which was also influenced by people from the London County Council, and people in New York would work there and were working with the regional plan. It was called Access Trees and creating these urban webs. And this is a project by Neville Mars looking at reappropriating kind of abandoned infrastructure, major pipeline in Mumbai, into kind of urban public space.
So our students have already seen this, but and I don't know if everyone's familiar with this, but we always start with this image because this is from the movie by Michael Winterbottom, Jude the Obscure. But it's a beautiful example of the kind of the spatial dynamic of living beings. And so we try to train ourselves to be aware of that form as a complement to the architectural forms that we also love to design. This is a bridge connection, a competition that we won in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota that connects two sides of the campus across the Mississippi River.
It was held by the Weissman Art Museum, who had just finished the recent Gary addition to their original Gary
so the
building. Gary is on the left circle, and it's the upper building. This is a multi-level connector, and so what we wanted to do was to activate it as social space and give the Weissman, which is basically kind of an island surrounded by circulation, by traffic, a better connection to pedestrian and multimodal movement across the bridge. So we propose instead of another form, we proposed a very open, programmable space that would connect the two sides. The main pieces that you see here are kind of pulling back the glass bridge, creating this extended shade canopy, and then connections down to the lower level.
And so as part of that, again, to sort of continuously remind ourselves of the form of human occupation, we did an animation.
A lot of the pieces that we felt that we had inserted or modified were about changing these flows of movement and kind of reconfiguring, redirecting, creating spaces for activities and program and spontaneous events.
And so this basically shows various programs being activated to show the diversity, and I guess we don't need to.
What's useful is the before version that we did, but where you see this kind of congestion, not of people moving every which way and no place to go.
So just advocating that kind of sensibility to human occupation. So and then some of the interior pictures, this is the major space created at the entry to the Weissman. And then the bridge itself could be activated as programmable exhibition space and for a diversity of different activities. A suspended structure that provided shading and protection over the main space. I won't go into the details. And finally, we're going to show the Falls, which is another infrastructure-related project that we're currently working on in Minneapolis and have been for 4 years. It involves the redevelopment of the center of Minneapolis's waterfront area. There's a major falls, the largest falls on the Mississippi, at the north end of the Mississippi is right in the middle of Minneapolis. And so that's the location of this lock system that was built in the 60s. And so it has been now shut down by the Army Corps of Engineers. So we're working on revitalizing it through a transformation into a public amenity. And
so they're basically, by shutting it down, they're preventing invasive species from going north, but they're still using it to control flood levels. So it has some functioning. So
here you see the falls, the man-made falls. The original falls was changed with the lock. And you're looking down on it here. Now this project is really complex because all the government agencies from the federal level down to the city are interested and have a stake in it, and the public is very keenly aware of it and constantly monitoring it. So we have been developing multiple designs. I'll show you one of the earlier ones, but here you're looking down on the existing site. This is the proposed design, which is to create a large public space at the center of the lock and stone arch bridge, which is a 19th century artifact, the curved piece. A really beautiful element in the city. Here you see the lock itself, which is powerful and dramatic,
and if you've been through it in a boat, you know, just the experience of, you know, the doors closing, the water dropping, and you slowly sink, was also something that we wanted to capture, that kind of interior space.
And so we proposed, they wanted parking, so we proposed 2 levels of parking, 140 cars, and then a large exhibition space and other functional spaces that were below the plaza. And then we devised ways of getting down into those levels and connecting into spaces in the lock itself. Here's an aerial view looking down on it at night. And this is the plaza side, the sloping green surface and an entry area. And then that, we call it the gantry. That's a structural element that allows us to cut a hole down to the exhibition level. Then the connection to the north, where there's going to be a wide range of activities available to people to use the water. This is the gantry element on the interior. Well, you'd be up against the huge concrete wall of the lot. And then down below the exhibition area, which has really got a spectacular view of the Stone Arch Bridge. Then spaces that carve into the lock itself and penetrate through to see the falls and the 3rd Avenue Bridge in the background. And views downriver. That's a trestle that was built into the Stone Arch Bridge in the 60s. And then a view of the down inside end of the lock where the boats would leave.
People actually, this is the part of the Mississippi where it's still somewhat clean, and so people actually use the river a lot.
So that's the last of the images. And what we're trying to do is to show that, and if you're, I'd be curious to see what you think about it, but you know, our work on urbanism is actually something that now guides much of what we think about, even doing these little projects. And we think that relationship of understanding the larger forces at play and your position in it is critical if you're going to work effectively in small scale projects. And we also don't want to see cities that are governed simply by the large, huge developments and the overarching infrastructural logic. So.